After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves to be alone. He was transfigured in front of them, and his clothes became dazzling, extremely white, as no launderer on earth could whiten them. Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let's set up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," because he did not know what to say, since they were terrified. A cloud appeared, overshadowing them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept this word to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. Then they asked him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" "Elijah does come first and restores all things," he replied. "Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did whatever they pleased to him, just as it is written about him." I was lost, not geographically, but spiritually. I was in seminary and eyeball deep in studies about Bible and theology and the like. And though I was learning a lot about God, at that point I felt disconnected from God. I had always in my life had this sense of connection, and I just didn't feel it at that point. And I went everywhere I could think of to try to rekindle it. And I had the opportunity to take a trip through the seminary in Paul's second missionary journey, following in those footsteps where he went. And it was amazing. It was through the west coast of Turkey, up to Istanbul, and across to Greece, and down through all of those places we read about, Thessalonica, Philippi, and all of those, and ultimately to Athens and Corinth. And while I was there, we were going to be in the cathedral in Athens on January 6th. January 6th is a much bigger deal in Europe than it is here. Epiphany is the big day of celebration. And in the center of orthodoxy, a big cathedral, surely there, my spirit would be kindled again. Except it wasn't. So fast forward a few weeks, and I'm back in my apartment, and I needed a break from studying. I went back out on my back porch in the evening, and I looked up at the night sky. I was overcome with the vastness of it. It was just so beautiful. And I couldn't help but thinking, who am I in the midst of all of this? And then, like a wave that kind of hits you all at once, it came. That connection I had chased across continents and everywhere else, it came. I felt God's Spirit within me again, and I heard this message, "My grace is sufficient." Have you ever had those moments when you look up at the night sky and feel the weight of the universe and how small we are in the midst of it? Have you ever stood before a mountain and just realized that there's so much more to this world than what we can see or know? What if we approached God with that same degree of awe and wonder? And at times we do, no doubt, but I think a lot of times day to day we might forget that. And recovering that sense of God's grandeur and awe and mystery can move us in our faith. In that moment on my back porch, I realized something, that the vastness of this universe, the mystery of God's ways, is part of the very power of connecting with God. It's not about fully understanding it. It's about feeling it in our depths. If we try to reason our way there, we might fall short. But when we are invited by that mystery and we follow and listen, amazing things can happen. So what does it mean for us to serve a God who is both mysterious and near? A God whose ways are beyond our understanding and yet invites us into relationship. And this is where the tension lies. We can't fully comprehend God's nature, and yet God wants us to know God's heart. In fact, the Bible is filled with images and stories and illustrations that show us how both intimate and vast God is. And at times, God's mystery is awe-inspiring and even a little scary. And yet, we are drawn into it. We are called to embrace it. Take, for example, that story that's so common to us that it kind of loses a bit of its supernatural quality. That time when Moses was out minding his own business, taking care of the sheep, and then all of a sudden this bush was burning without being consumed. Just imagine it for a moment. We've heard it so many times that it's kind of tame in our understanding. But what would it be like to happen upon something like that? The fire blazing from it, but the bush is not being consumed. It was a holy moment, and Moses recognized it as such and took his shoes off to approach, and the voice of God came from it. Moses knew he was in the midst of something holy, and he was drawn into it, and he listened. I mean, he also argued, but ultimately he listened and he followed. Or think about that moment when God speaks to Job from the whirlwind. We're a little more familiar with the story in Job when he has everything and it's all taken from him, and he suffers greatly. And his friends come and comfort him. I mean, mostly they just say you're a sinner and have somehow deserved it, but nonetheless, Job stands his ground and will not say anything bad against God. And then Job starts to lose his faith a little bit, and he has all these questions. And from the whirlwind, we know what a whirlwind is. We've seen tornadoes in this part of the country. Imagine a tornado in front of us, and from it, God's speaking. And God doesn't answer Job's questions. God doesn't calm Job's fears. God kind of calls him to account, asking him questions, but inviting him to embrace the mystery. Next week, we're going to do a deeper dive into the story where Simon, is yet to be called Peter, is out fishing, desperately trying to get by. And all of a sudden, Jesus appears, and his boat is filled with fish. They had been out fishing all night and had caught nothing, and Jesus tells them to try it again, and I can see the eye rolls as they go out. It's like, all right, we did this all night and there's nothing, but whatever. And they drop the nets again, and there's such a huge catch that the nets are breaking and bursting. In response to that, Simon falls to his knees before Jesus and says, I need you to flee from me. I'm a sinful man, and this is too much. Sometimes the mystery of God is so great, we can't comprehend it, but we're invited into it. Like this example in the Transfiguration, we've talked a lot about mystery, and this one is the biggest one in my thoughts anyway. I think it might be my favorite passage in the Bible. If there's any place I could go to, I think it would be on that mountain of Transfiguration. But imagine being there in that moment, and Jesus's divinity just becomes on full display. He turns almost supernatural before them, all in full glory, blazing white, more than any words can aptly describe. And Moses and Elijah appear there with him. And if that's not enough, then God's voice also speaks to them and says, this is my beloved Son. Listen to him. I mean, there's a whole lot of mystery and a whole lot of grandeur in that story. And they didn't understand it. Jesus knew they wouldn't understand it and said as much. He's like, look, this is going to make a whole lot more sense later. Just for now, keep this to yourself. But after I suffer and die, later on, you can share this story. But it invited them in. That grandeur, that mystery, invited the disciples in, and they listened and they followed. In the story, we see the tension of God's mystery, too vast to fully understand, but undeniable in its power. Like the disciples, we too are often flummoxed with the presence of God. When we see something so beautiful, our instinct isn't to understand why it is, but just to embrace it. I don't want to speak for you, but when I see a sunset, I don't start thinking about how the light refracts through the different layers of air and how warm air makes it. That's not part of my process. When I see the sunset, my soul just breathes it in. When there's a painting so beautiful or a piece of music so full with spirit and life, we don't do the math in our heads. Our spirits are drawn in. As we reflect on the transfiguration and the mystery of God's power and presence, I want to leave you with one final thought. The mystery of God is not a barrier to keep us from faith. And in fact, a lot of people that we meet who aren't people of faith, that is a barrier. They don't understand God, or they don't understand why God would fill in the blank. But God is not about understanding. God is about inviting, embracing, trusting, and following. The disciples saw the glory of God in that moment on the mountain, but they had no idea what was coming next. They didn't understand the full significance of what they had witnessed, but that moment of awe and mystery would stay with them. God's grace is sufficient. So I invite you to embrace the mystery. Look at the awe-inspiring things in your life and say, yeah, I don't have to understand it all, but I know that God is in it, and that is enough. Because like the disciples, we're invited to encounter God in a way that transforms us, that empowers us, and calls us to trust in something bigger than ourselves. Do you remember the first time you held your baby? Do you remember the first time that baby looked at you? Can't explain that, but something big happened. And it changed you. It changed me. We don't understand it, but we're invited into it. And it changes us. It grows us. It draws us more closer to God. So carry that with you today. The mystery of God isn't something to figure out. It's something to lean into. And God's grace is sufficient. Let's sing.